Good morning, everyone. We'll just wait for a few minutes to allow any stragglers to join us. Yes, I said stragglers, Paul. That's correct. Good morning, dobro jutro, and all the others. I'm a bit frayed this morning, as I imagine many of you are, but I thank you for bearing with us here into the third day of the conference, especially because we have a real treat this morning. I think it's my, well, I don't think I know, it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce our third keynote speaker who, in particular in a room such as this, I think doesn't really require an introduction, which is good because she's given me a very short bio. Maria Todorova is the author of The Lost World of Socialists at Europe's Margins from 2020, Scaling the Balkans from 2018, Remembering Communism in 2014, Post-Communist Nostalgia in 2010, Bones of Contention in 2009, Imagining the Balkans in 2009, I think that was the second edition probably, and Balkan Family Structure and European Pattern in 2006, among other monographs and edited volumes. She is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and it's really a delight to welcome her to share some of her more recent meditations with us today.
Thank you. We are coming down now. Thank you so much. It's an honor. Oh, it's an honor, Jeremy. Thank you for the invitation. My task is a little bit difficult coming after two great keynotes and a score of brilliant papers, but at least you will see a different performance. We had a wonderful improvisation with PowerPoint. We had a wonderful Zoom with PowerPoint, and I will have a paper without PowerPoint. So, we are here convened under the general rubric of postcolonial, decolonial, post-imperial, de-imperial. These are all derivatives of imperial and colonial. So in my talk, I would like first to address the different historiographies around the basic concepts of empire and colonialism, and then analyze the use of the derivatives. My talk is in two parts. In the first part, I will argue for academic rigor. In the second part, I will argue against myself to loosen the rigor. I think that Medina would call that double self-critique. So I pose two questions. Is any empire colonial? Is any experience with an empire colonial? If it is, or some of it is, when is it time? In the last few decades, roughly from the 1990s on, empire, which had been the orphan of nationalism studies in the 20th century, took off like a rocket. There is now an enviable corpus of synthetic studies on empire, which is dominating the 21st century, most of which is overshadowed by analysis of the British Empire. In our field, and I think Gruya mentioned that yesterday, especially influential was Jane Burbank's and Fred Cooper's Empires in World History, among others because it paid close attention to empires functioning in the eastern part of Europe, reflecting the contemporary reassessment of the Romanov, Ottoman, and Habsburg empires. Their book came out in 2010, and it was hailed as a foremost authorial synthesis. Now we already have edited collective synthesis and even an encyclopedia on empire. There is general agreement, almost close to a consensus, that empires can be traced as far back as the recorded history goes. Indeed, most history is the history of empires. It is the nation state, an essentially 19th century ideal, that is the historical novelty and that may yet prove to be a more ephemeral entity. This is a quote from Burbank, and Ferguson also writes in this vein. I say almost close to a consensus, since there were lucid, if softly stated, and polite concerns about these universalist claims. Some came from scholars of antiquity, who objected that empire is a concept that has been used retrospectively, even vis-à-vis the Roman Empire. There was almost no attention to historical difference. The urge was to see structural patterns. The focus was on political history, and the contrast and break with the nation state was too stark. In a way, it was an effort to gather all so-called imperial phenotypes within the same genotype. Complaints of errors of area specialists notwithstanding, one has to recognize that it is the sweeping, sometimes overgeneralized accounts that trigger debates, fruitful correctives, and advance knowledge. Still, one has to see these words in the context of the Zeitgeist, and I'm aware that Zeitgeist is a controversial category, especially for Germans, but I still find that it is more useful, at least for me, than others like the bland ambience. Right? After the lamentable performance of nationalism in the wake of the two world wars, the reassessment of both the nation state and empire was inevitable. The drive for homogeneity and uniformity of nationalism was juxtaposed to the complexity and relative ethnic and religious toleration, which is unfairly translated into tolerance of empires, so much so that a redemptive and romanticizing tendency was observable, especially as regards the British and Habsburgs, but now increasingly the Romanov and the Ottoman Empire. We had a wonderful panel on Ottoman afterlives. Burbank and Cooper were free of this affliction. And despite their disclaimer that, I quote, investigating the history of empires does not imply praising or condemning them, their narrative predictably led in this direction with a stress on diversity. They were explicit in their motives to challenge the teleology of the nation state as natural, necessary and inevitable against the deeply entrenched litany that says history proceeds from empires to nation states. They successfully made empire normal. But zeitgeists change. In the first 2 decades of the 21st century, empires or quasi-imperial formations were welcomed, including the ones who maintained that they were not like the USA or the European Union. While scholars were questioning the deterministic view that empires were doomed to failure and disintegration, Now, with the war in Ukraine, imperial entropy is elevated to a law. It has found its voices, scholarly and measured, like in the words of Serhii Plokhy, or strident, like Anne Applebaum's "The Russian Empire Must Die." Tim Snyder is confident that the war in Ukraine will be seen as a colonial war and I quote, "an imperial war in the sense that in choosing to fight this war, Russian elites were self-consciously defining themselves as an empire as opposed to a normal state," end quote. We have come back the full circle, from bad empires to good nation states, from bad nation states to good empires, from bad empires to good nation states. Zeitgeists have different norms of normality. This last quote introduces colonialism, ignoring Burbank's and Cooper's wise warning that imperial name-calling, invocations of the word empire and colonialism to discredit interventions by American, French, and other governments, does not provide means to analyze or improve today's world. But colonialism in its derivatives, postcolonial, postcoloniality, neocolonial, quasi-colonial, anti-colonial, crypto-colonial even, I've found, decolonial, decoloniality, decolonization, transcoloniality are ubiquitous, just as are empire and its derivatives, imperial, anti-imperial, imperialism, imperiality, inter-imperiality, and so on. Just to remind you, yesterday we were reminded that the annual theme of ACES last year was decolonization, although the then president of the association, Julia Johnson, was more circumspect, and she wrote about decentering Russia. But for Eva Thompson, the author of Imperial Knowledge, Russian Literature and Colonialism, decentering was not enough. She had been right to lament that other Slavic languages and literature were invisible and mute, but now she was explicitly for canceling. Not only athletes in the Olympics, ballerinas and opera singers, and I quote, "Right now," she says, "I'm in sympathy with those who want to cancel such things. You cannot erase Dostoevsky and Tolstoy from the literary vocabulary, but you can simply not teach them at this point. And Bulgakov simply should be dropped in the memory hole." In an interview last December, she added, "Russian literature is not very good when you take away Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. Regarding the amount of literary works in existence, Russian literature is certainly smaller than British, German, French, or even Polish literature." And yet, we sometimes, she says, treat Russia as it was as productive as France and Great Britain. Courses dealing with trivial things, such as, for instance, Pushkin's Poetics, should be removed. Forget Nabokov and Pushkin. She also defined colonialism, the military conquest of a certain nation. But since she emphasized nation, this actually is interesting because it pertains to my first question, are all empires colonial? For her, the conquests of Alexander the Great were not colonialism because in those days people didn't have this consciousness that they were members of a nation. She also held the Slavic studies were colonized by Russian propaganda, and she named the main culprits, Nicholas Riazanovsky, Stephen Cohen, and Dmitry Trenin. Two have died, one is cancelled. I'm not making a list of what I think is ridiculous name bashing, but to just giving you an example from a recognized scholar, not from politicians, and alas, from today's journalists whose professional task is to inflate. Stephen Howe has provided us perhaps with the most useful definition of empire and colonization, allowing to start a meaningful analysis from a basic and unchallenged understanding. And let me quote, "An empire is a large, composite, multi-ethnic or multinational political unit, usually created by conquest and divided between a dominant center and subordinate, sometimes distant peripheries. Colonization refers to large-scale population movements where the migrants maintain strong links with the ancestors' former country, gaining specific privileges over other inhabitants of the territory by such links," end quote. His careful definition of empire allows for the elaboration of typologies, but also for temporal distinction. There is a whole body of literature dealing with issues of understanding and defining the categories of empire or imperialism and colonial empire and colonialism, and the differences between them. Striking is the cavalier attitude about this distinction between imperial and colonial. After all, at stake are very different theoretical framings in each case. In fact, most careful theorists, not only historians, lament that colonial and imperial are often used interchangeably. What specifically makes an empire a colonial empire? Or if we take colonization in its literal sense of settling a territory, is any empire and any state colonial at its inception? Barbara R. Neal introduces a useful distinction between colonization, which she calls the historical process through which people were colonized, and colonialism, which is a common ideology to justify such entities and processes. Imperialism is also treated as an ideology. Adopting a historically attuned and comparative approach, she advances a fourfold argument. First, colonialism in the modern period is a modern ideology characterized by three principles: segregation, agrarian labor, and improvement, amelioration, of both backward, meaning idle, lazy, irrational, or custom-bound peoples, or empty land, providing justification for both colonies in foreign lands and domestic colonies. Secondly, in the 19th century, imperialism shifts from conquest towards civilizing missions, development, and democratization, overlapping with the colonialist principle of improvement. By the early 20th century, imperialism is redefined by Hobson and Lenin as a global system of exploitation and extraction rather than simply domination. Thirdly, the two terms become fully conflated in the wake of the Second World War, when colonialism is redefined to mean exclusively overseas racialized domination and becomes synonymous with imperialism. Finally, she shows that distinguishing the colonial from the imperial can explain how colonialism, rooted in amelioration, could be strongly embraced by many liberal, socialist, and anarchist thinkers from the 70s to the early 20th century, even as they forcefully rejected imperialism. Think Max Weber. While at the same time 20th century Asian and African leaders viewed themselves primarily as anti-colonialists in a global system of imperialism. Most theorists resort to different typologies: maritime versus land, or contiguous pre-modern versus modern empires, formal versus informal, and so on. There is, however, an overwhelming consensus that modern European overseas empires from the 16th century onward, that is, both early modern, and I insist on this combination, usually defined as colonial empires, do present a qualitatively new phenomenon, and this has to do with mercantilism, industry, and capitalism. I quote, "The essential point is that although European colonialisms involved a variety of techniques and patterns of domination, penetrating deep into some societies and involving a comparatively superficial contact with others, all of them produced the economic imbalance that was necessary for the growth of European capitalism and industry." And no wonder the status of Ireland is the object of a very, very lively historiography, but the ones who accept the formal definition of colony confine it only to the 19th century. Taking cue from this important distinction between pre-modern and modern empires, I've argued elsewhere that the Ottoman Empire was not a colonial empire in the modern sense. I will very briefly lay out my argument. A number of features do not allow us to describe it as a modern colonial empire, with a partial exception vis-à-vis the Arab provinces in the late post-Tanzimat decades, when the Balkans had already seceded. First, there was no abyss of institutional legal distinction between metropole and dependencies. Second, there was no previous stable entity which colonized. The Ottoman Empire became an elaborate state machine and an empire in the course of shaping itself as an expanding polity, which was a whole in all its territories. Third, there was no amelioration complex, no civilizing mission comparable to the French or the English one, again, with the exception of Arab provinces in the final decades of the empire. Fourth, there was no hegemonic cultural residue from the Ottoman Empire comparable to the linguistic and cultural hegemony of English in the Indian subcontinent and elsewhere, and French in Africa and Indochina, and of Russian, although weaker, in Central Asia and the Caucasus. These factors also apply as a whole to the Habsburgs. The one convincingly argued exception as colonial or quasi-colonial, although contested, is Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Rutner or Bojana Leksov. While the imperial and colonial status of the Romanov Empire is not disputed, it comes with important qualifications when we heard Medina about that. On the other hand, both the imperialism and the colonialism of the post-Soviet, of the posited Soviet empire has been intelligently and openly debated, especially with the advent of the so-called new imperial history. It is also important to take account of self-perceptions. Subjectivity matters. None of the contemporaries in the Balkans under Ottoman rule felt that they were in a colonial positionality. The only ones who saw a kind of semi-colonial status vis-à-vis Western imperialism were Ottoman intellectuals at the time. For that reason, post-colonial studies had not really made a methodological inroad in the Balkans and in Eastern Europe until recently. In contrast to Wallerstein's world system theory, immensely popular in Greece and in Turkey from the 80s on, and widely read also in Eastern Europe before 1989. But let me give you, there is a curious instance of explicit decolonial subjectivity avant la lettre from the 1920s, none other than the Prince Nikolai Trubetskoy, the Prague Linguistic School, who opposed pan-Romano-Germanic chauvinism as a synonym for Eurocentrism and deplored Russia's subordinate status like that of the ancient Mexicans or Incas. Russia, he wrote, will be a colony similar to India, Egypt, and Morocco. As David Choney Moore in his review notes, he's wrong in linking Russia to many types of physically colonized peoples, because Russia, of course, itself was one of the great colonizing powers. But he's right, because so much of the broader world has had, for the last century at least, to define itself in part with regards to Western Europe. Of late, a young professor from the University of Basel published a passionate opinion piece in Al Jazeera, arguing that Russian imperialism was overlooked because Western scholars ignored the colonial character of the Soviet Empire, and its dissolution came without decolonization, even though Florian Bieber has warned that the need to abandon Russia-centrism is not well described by the term decolonizing when it comes to Western academia and research, as it conflates Western bias toward important or large powers like Russia with Russian colonialism and imperialism. There is no question that today, not only in Ukraine, the Baltics, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, but also increasingly in Eastern Europe, from Poland to Bulgaria, the period of Soviet dominance is represented as colonialism. And now it is time to decolonize from this legacy. All I can say, and I would stand corrected, is that both internal critics at the time of the Soviet Union and external ones, that is, the ones who were not afraid of censorship or did not practice auto-censorship, spoke of oppression, subjugation, plundering, even slavery. The empire was authoritarian, totalitarian, murderous, genocidal, evil, but not colonial. As far as Eastern Europe was concerned, I'm not speaking about Central Asia. I'm not saying the decolonial perception is wrong. there should be freedom for subjectivity. But I insist that the naming of this perception as decolonial is a neologism in the contemporary emancipatory discourse. Why specifically decolonization is used over a quality of other analogues has mostly to do, as far as I can see, with the metaphorical and liberating power evoking the saintly specters of Mahatma Gandhi and Frantz Fanon. I made my argument about the Ottoman Empire at the height of post-colonial studies when I was urged actually by friends to link Balkanism to Orientalism and directly to post-colonialism. The appeal came exclusively from literary scholars, not historians, and philosophers who care less about ahistoricism. So here is a quote. While it is true, one friend claimed, that the social, political, and economic relationship between the European imperial powers and their overseas possessions differed from those between the Ottoman state and the Balkans, why could the wars of independence against this rule not be considered post-colonial? We land in the midst of a methodological conundrum. Is every national movement necessarily anti-colonial, and does it always produce a post-colonial situation? Was Garibaldi unifying Italy against Austrian colonizers? Should we explain Fichte's address to the German nation as a post-colonial critique of French occupation and hegemony? Are Kurds in Turkey, Iraq, and Syria waging an anti-colonial struggle? Here I'm on shaky ground. Did Croatian, Slovenian, Muslim, Bosnian, and Kosovar Albanian nationalism culminate in an anti-colonial war against the Serb colonizer? Is ETA the post-colonial avant-garde of Basque nationalism? I plead really personal deformation, but to me time-bound and place-bound specificity counts. It counts in order to avoid cognitive deformation, but matters also on ethical grounds. The emancipatory mantle of post-colonialism all too often serves as a cover for the perpetual lament of victimization and inadvertently opens the door to nationalism. It is in the wake of successful anti-colonial struggles after the Second World War that scholars from the previous colonies were faced with the lingering effects of the colonial legacy. And that gave the spur to what eventually was formulated as post-colonial studies. They have an established epistemological pedigree in post-structuralist theory, as well as a very concrete provenance in the work of subaltern scholars from South Asia in the 1980s. The link to Orientalism was identified by positing the lifespan of post-colonial studies from Said's Orientalism to Harden Negri's empire, so between 1978 and 2000. The post-colonial field has meant different things to different people. One may generalize that what has occurred in the quarter century after the appearance of Orientalism was a disciplinary shift in post-colonial, global, third world studies away from sociological and economic analysis toward cultural, theoretical, semiotic, and discursive analysis. Simultaneously, post-colonial studies challenged the theoretical models and meta-narratives built on the earlier dominant paradigms of modernization, development, and world system theory. The problem is that post-colonial studies themselves became a new meta-narrative. And in fact, Chatterjee explicitly said it is a new global meta-narrative. Although it is fair to say that despite some conservative hysteria, it has been rarely institutionalized. Incomparably more attention is paid to global, to global studies and the notion of globalization, something that is an eloquent illustration of the different ideological baggages which come with the two. Nonetheless, it has undoubtedly achieved an honorary status. What is very interesting is that precisely at the time when some were positing the melancholic phase or even the end of post-colonial studies, some East European intellectuals posed the question of their relation to the post-colonial, and I'm talking about the early years of this century. Mostly, however, they referred to the post-socialist period and the involvement of Eastern Europe in the process of globalization. Contemporary East European intellectuals increasingly see themselves in a subordinate position vis-à-vis the centers of knowledge production and dissemination in the West, and some explicitly speak of intellectual neo-imperialism, neo-colonialism, self-colonization, whence the identification with postcoloniality and decoloniality. This is where, according to me, an opening is produced through which postcolonial and decolonial theory finds an attentive ear among a new intellectual clientele. I repeated my argument about the Ottoman Empire a decade later, responding to a different framework suggested again by Tim Snyder. In his theoretical proposition, he offered a global binary process between integration and disintegration, which in a bold conceptual leap was translated into colonization, decolonization. And I quote, "A historical framework which permits Ukraine to be seen as a subject and an object of the projects of integration and disintegration, as a link between European history and global history, might help us make sense of present conflicts, and making sense of them just might help them closer to an end," end quote. Integration and disintegration is indeed the safer bet between the two pairs of dichotomies, because it is difficult to specify historically. It is general enough to be universally applicable, but what does it say concretely? How is it different from any cyclical or helical theory, from other dualities like centralization versus secession, conquest versus resistance, subjugation versus opposition, or the rise and fall genre? The Romans integrated the Mediterranean world and then disintegrated. Over several millennia, China experienced several ways of integration or expansion and then contraction. And the Incas had an empire before the Spaniards, before they themselves were conquered by Spain. This can be, continued ad infinitum, and the whole exercise becomes meaningless. But as I said, in a leap of faith, based on the assertion that European and global history are separated by the word colonial, this is Tim Snyder, the dichotomy integration-disintegration morphed into colonization-decolonization. And here came the claim to a theoretical contribution, which triggered my response because the Balkans were involved. Decolonization does not begin in the 20th century, according to Snyder, in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, but in Europe, more specifically the Balkans. Balkan revolutions against Ottoman rule, he says, usually categorized as national, were the beginning of the decolonial moment. Not only did they pioneer decolonization, but their model of nationalism became more significant than the French one. This argument surreptitiously reproduced the divide between Western and Eastern type of nationalism. Furthermore, it posited the Balkan model succeeded as a method of disintegration, but failed as a method of reintegration. Reintegration into what? Into the then existing Habsburg Empire, or the rising German Reich, or as a province of the Russian Empire? Or a Danubian and Balkan federation, which was actually mostly espoused by socialists, on which I've written, but it was an anathema for Europe at the time. So Snyder unwittingly raised the negative specter of Kleinstaaterei. The practical purpose of Snyder's model was to create a global, breathing Gaia between gasps of integration and disintegration, colonization and decolonization, which serves as a receptacle for Ukraine, aiming at the present moment to achieve an integrative Hegelian Aufhebung in the European Union. And this is fine as long as it is recognizable as a political platform, but not as a scholarly contribution. The argument that the Balkans pioneered decolonization hinged on the premise that the Ottoman Empire was colonial. From my perspective, with neither a colony nor a colonizer in the 19th century Balkans, again, I'm specific time and place, the employment of the concept decolonization is gratuitous. Not every form of subjugation and power hegemony can be termed colonial. Not every resistance is decolonization. The point here is not to impose my interpretation of history as true, but rather to plead for a minimal level of professional rigor that is necessary for scholarship to thrive and progress. There are consequences to a careless attitude to concepts. Imprecision and lack of meticulousness makes the concepts unworkable. This leads to misidentification, misconceptions, and errors. It means essentially a breach of the conventions of the historical and any profession that precludes the critical engagement with other scholars' works and serious debates that can lead to advancements of scholarship. Admittedly, I speak for academia, and I'm aware of the critique against the limitations of logocentric academic thinking and disciplinary rigidity. So now I'm beginning to argue against myself. Indeed, definitional rigidity can be broken in order to open space for innovation, for new theoretical and conceptual moves. It can also be motivated by considerations outside the strict advancement of scholarship. And there are numerous and positive examples in this respect, with the rethinking of the notions of class, gender, race, the social, the everyday, which have launched new perspectives of inquiry and have advanced knowledge. Scholars have broadened the definition of the colonial, postcolonial, and decolonial for specific purposes, most often to join them to a broader universal conversation. A major impulse in our field in this direction was Sharat Chari's and Catherine Verrier's intervention by introducing a dialogue between postcolonialism and post-socialism. For them, quote, just as postcoloniality had become a critical perspective on the colonial present, post-socialism could become a similarly critical standpoint on the continuing social and spatial effects of Cold War power and knowledge, end quote. Implicitly, the premise was the equivalence between the capitalist empires and the crumbling Soviet one. And there was subtle critique of the analogies they made between the post-colonial and post-socialist. Most serious, their utter erasure of the contributions of Second World to the struggles of the Third World, and most of the critique came from Yugoslav scholars. For others, Chari and Verrier's article opened up categories that were almost exclusively used to conceptualize the non-European experience, and thus empowered East European intellectuals by propelling them into a paradigm which was speaking a universal language. The attraction to both post-colonialism and decolonial theory stemmed also from the fact that they emanated not from the metropolis, but from outside, and they were generated exclusively outside Western Europe from the global periphery, and that was an appeal to East Europeans. Here I want to address the contributions of a young, talented scholar, cohort of scholars, very many from the Balkans, who have been directly inspired by the Latin American decolonial theoreticians. I hold very many of them in high esteem and think they have produced brilliant work. This group includes a broad variety of professionals: philosophers, sociologists, political scientists, literary scholars, anthropologists, urban historians, art and architectural historians, visual culture and media theorists, performance studies, geographers, feminist critics, artists, and a number of activists. And a disclaimer, there is no hierarchy in my enumeration, but tellingly, they are not the usual historians inside. No economic, social, political, and cultural historians. But as a forum pointed out, and these were my friends Živka and Rosen and Nikolai Kirkov, they said earlier scholarship had primarily taken place within the disciplinary domain of history, while nowadays the name was of a decidedly interdisciplinary intervention. But good historians destabilize not with grand historical narratives, which can serve as an enemy, but with time-specific and space-specific analyses, while they do not oppose the call for going beyond static typologies and fixed geographical units or scales to argue for interconnectivity. And the best use interdisciplinary tools. In fact, in the last decade, there are quite a number of studies, not only from the Balkans, but from Eastern Europe as a whole, that have gone beyond the regional framework toward Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Still, lest my last remark sounds too defensive, There is indeed a generational difference, and it has to do with the zeitgeist. The work of the earlier generation of scholars, Larry Wolff, Milica Bakic-Hayden, Vesna Goldworthy, myself, and many others, indeed sidestepped, if not necessarily ignored, questions of political economy. This was so not because we were blind to these problems, but in the era that we were writing, the early 1990s, when we produced our work, it was after the fall of the Warsaw Pact and the demise of the Soviet Union, and the central political issue was exclusion or inclusion within the European framework, defined as a process of structural and segmented integration of the former socialist bloc into Western and Western-led formations of political, economic, and military power, such as the EU, the IMF, the World Bank, NATO. To use the vocabulary of the new identity generation, we attempted to queer the approach to the Balkans and the European Union. This was also an activist position, but it had inevitably its blind spots and a good deal of erasure of inconvenient history. Some 20 years later, almost 30 years later, with the brutal effects of the neoliberal capitalist experiments, including shock therapy, radical austerity, privatization of the commons, flat tax, wage cuts, flexible employment, and forced vacation, whose real impact was difficult to anticipate at the very outset, a new generation boldly inscribes itself in the anti-capitalist and decolonial tradition, while at the same time subtly critiquing it for having erased East European socialism with all its ambiguities and subsuming it under the rubric of capitalist modernity. And Madina actually spoke of this one-way dialogue with Mignolo and others. All these contributions are inspired by decolonial thought as it was developed from the 1990s, by scholars and activists representing indigenous social movements in Latin America. Quijano, Grossfugel, Dussel, Mignolo, Escobar, and many others. An important article summarized the conceptual advantages of the decolonial critique for our region. Most important, according to the authors, is the effort to foreground the historical experience of state socialism. So they are really time-bound. State socialism as a way of collective coexistence in the form of practices, social mores, institutional arrangements, alternative systems of value that was often in significant tension with both Occidental reason and the logic of capitalist accumulation. Other benefits are the repositioning of Eastern Europe on the semi-periphery of both global capitalist and global colonial hegemonies by pointing to structural analogies. Yet another most interesting contribution is thinking through world regions and the stress on imperiality. The notion of imperial difference describes the modern empires that were structured along the modes of coloniality of the 16th century, the Spanish and Portuguese, the so-called first modernity, but lost power or fell under the domination of other Western imperial and colonial powers, England, France, Netherlands, the so-called second modernity, 18th, 19th century. And to them, this thought adds the second-rate or not quite Western modern empires such as the Ottoman Sultanate and the Russian Empire. The momentous task of decolonial thought could then be understood as the work of recognizing and undoing the colonial difference and the imperial differences operating in given localities and historical moments. And this is a quote: "The colonial difference and the imperial differences are articulated differently in Eastern Europe and in the post-Soviet world, as opposed to the Caribbean, West Africa, and Southeast Asia, though one can identify structural similarities." This comes from Kharkov and from this the Diversia volume. It is through the encounter between colonial and imperial differences that Kirchhoff and other authors explain Eastern Europe's dual status as both a semi-periphery to the capitalist world economy as an aspirationally white civilized part of colonial Europe. The concept of imperial difference was also applied by Manuela Buarque to explain how different parts of Eastern Europe beginning in the 16th century followed a sequence that went from proto-colonial to neo-colonial at best, but in the absence of formal colonization. The concept of coloniality of power as elevated as a central explanatory idea, even if it shows by some of these authors an uneasiness with their global claims. Now, my sensitivities are that of a historian. And I understand that ahistorical thinking is not as irritating to others who are interested primarily in methodology. But the stark separation and juxtaposition of a first and second modernity is artificial. The issue is what these separations are serving. In the case of the first and second modernity, it is a critique of Eurocentrism about involving Latin America, but also identifying it as a pioneer of modernity, reminiscent of the pioneering modular theory of Ben Anderson about nationalism. Spain and Portugal are the first modern nations, and they start the first stage of modernity. World mercantilism with control over the Atlantic. The world system and modernity began in 1492. The second stage, the Industrial Revolution, simply expands that beginning after the 15th century. Can we call this search for precedents Latin American centrism? Is any shift of hegemony a constructive thing? Decoloniality has traveled from the modest Americanicity as a concept, which was very nice by Quijano and Wallerstein, to a globalized grand meta-narrative, which we have now in Mignolo. The question that East European scholars raise is whether we can speak about coloniality in the absence of the reality of colonialism, and the young generation answers in the affirmative. For them, imperiality, which historically perhaps better describes the plight of Eastern Europe with all its racial, social, and economic realities, is nonetheless indelibly impacted by coloniality as a structural characteristic of Western hegemony. This looks to me like a proximate definition of modernity. Inter-imperiality, Laura Doyle's felicitous concept rhyming so well with intertextuality, has been successfully employed in the terrific work of Anca Barbulescu and Manuela Boatka, Creolizing the Modern. In my reading, inter-imperiality that they deployed can go with coloniality, and they are repeating it all the time, but it can also go without coloniality. Which is actually analogous to a palimpsest of legacies, of which I've argued, and not only imperial legacies. In a recent forum, Laura Doyle bemoaned the overuse of modern and wanted to ditch it altogether. "I wonder what other word can be used here," she exclaimed. I also wonder what other floating signifier can be ditched. I'm not fighting against the concept of decolonization. This is impossible. It is there. For how long is another question. It has become a kind of koine, a lingua franca, unifying diverse voices and a new generation. Some use it thoughtfully, others gratuitously. But the koine has dialectal differences and uses different pitches. The beasts or ghosts against which decolonization is directed are different. Capitalism, neoliberalism, colonialism, imperialism, imperial legacy, communism and communist legacies, nationalism, racism, misogyny, homophobia, Eurocentrism, progressivism, Euro-Atlanticism, Western civilization, Russian Empire, the United States, genocide, stereotypes and representations in art, media and education, academic studies, and so on. Strangely, and I would stand corrected again, there are calls for decolonizing traditional or subordinated religions. But I have yet to see calls for decolonization from religion as such, or from traditional mores. Is it because they have to be decolonized from the Enlightenment, understood as radicalized modernity is one of modernity's dark sides? Are we going to come full circle of decolonizing the Enlightenment and its bright sides of modernity itself? The worst thing that one can do with words is to surrender to them. Let the meaning choose the word, not the other one. This is not me, this is George Orwell. The best of works of this new generation need not inscribe themselves within a certain vocabulary and use it as a mantra, which reminds me of the mantras of the Marxist vocabulary under state socialism, even in the cases when it was correct. George Steinmetz asked, does it make sense to bring ideas like postcolonialism or colonial present into discussions of present-day racism? Answers to this question depend on the context. As a historian, I am all for contextualization and disambiguation, even as I am aware that to be historically specific is not to fail to be analytically universal. In the end, we may be doing the same thing, understanding or advancing knowledge, but taking different paths. The ones producing an immaculate theory and then inhabiting it with illustrations that prove it, and the others looking at the chaos of facts and proposing provisional and imperfect theories, ready to supplant them with ones more accommodating to a new array of facts. I understand and sympathize with the metaphorical use of decoloniality and as emancipation. I respect the attempts to involve our region in a universalizing discourse. I am all on the side of the ones who are anti-capitalist and anti-neoliberal activists, but the difficult question is what comes next. And we had a taste of that in yesterday's keynote, this mixture between Communist Manifesto and climate change, which I think is a lovely project. Andy. But I'm puzzled by the monistic quest for a unified field theory. Einstein failed. And I urge awareness of the pros and cons of a unifying paradigm and an omnipotent word. Decolonization and decoloniality are omnipotent because they are universal metaphors. Aristotle was right when he clipped, poetry is finer and more philosophical than history, for poetry expresses the universal and history only the particular. In my favorite play, this is Molière's Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme, probably because it has those fake Ottomans inside, Monsieur Jourdain discovers that there is nothing else than poetry and prose in which one can express oneself. So all that is not prose is poetry, and all that is not verse is prose. I admit that I speak prose, but when we analyze verse, we don't write another poem, we use prose. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. You somehow managed to be, despite what you've said, both poetic and yet also somehow Orwellian. No, we won't accuse you of that. I think we might need to take questions here at the podium as well, unless, well, perhaps we can. That's the microphone. You can take your question. Thank you for this immensely rich breakfast, which I think we're all digesting now, and I imagine that we'll have even some more dishes from the audience.
Vegetarian, please, only.
So I'm going to go for vegetarian, okay? Where do you see the next challenge coming from? In terms of, you know, what the meta-narratives that you might see emerging that you would make a similar argument against, or where can we head this off at the pass, maybe?
Well, it depends on what you're talking about. At this point, I think that you know, for this new generation, it's identity politics. I mean, it's very clear that that's what it is. It will pass, like everything passes. The thing is, I mean, you're asking me about what epistemology to use, and it depends for whom. I think, you know, decoloniality works well for Latin America, perhaps, like postcoloniality works well for Southeast Asia. For our region, I think imperiality, inter-imperiality, semi-periphery, semi-periphery works well. The accusation will be that these are Eurocentric. Well, Eastern Europe is in Europe, right? I mean, it's obvious. So even provincializing Europe is using European concepts, and what the heck? So I'm uneasy with this, you know, shift. We can provincialize Western Europe, but not kick it out, right? You can see that I'm very enlightened, pro-enlightenment. So, so again, the answer is you use some. Again, I've argued about that, particularly in the case of the Ottoman Empire. What kind of concepts to use, especially in terms of land regime? Do we use timar or do we use feudal structure? And it depends. If you are in a strictly, in a very close disciplinarian milieu where people know the concepts, then you use the local concepts in order to highlight the specificities. If you talk to people outside, you try to use universalist concepts in order to have the, you know, in order to have the conversation, in order to have the dialogue. Again, it depends on what you are looking at and what your position is at the moment and where the historiography has gone. If it has erred too much in the case of universalism, you try to push it back and make it more specific. If not, if it has become too provincial, then you try to pull it up and make it speak in more generalized terms. So again, it depends. It's a very unconcrete answer.
Hello, I'd like to look at it from a slightly different perspective. First, I found it fascinating, but you know, we're looking at it from recipient countries and people. They're the ones we colonialize and decolonialize and empires and such as this. But you can also look at it from the aspect of the empires. Because it's implying the empires have a clear policy. And having worked at the State Department of the United States during the Balkan Wars, I saw internally how desperately we were trying to understand the Balkans and put together a consistent policy. And that policy was never consistent. You know, Ambassador Holbrooke did his best, I suppose. But we were searching. So when you say the US wanted this, well, maybe at 9 a.m. on Tuesday, but at 10 o'clock on Wednesday, we'd kind of changed our mind. And I would use another example because I've been interested in it. And it's Ethiopia under the fascist regime. And in that time, if you look at what Mussolini stated when he declared war on Ethiopia, it is clear imperialism, clear imperialism. You know, he's going to come there, he's going to take that land, and he's going to make it part of an Italian empire. But then you look what he did. He couldn't put it together. You know, everything, you know, sort of came down to we're going to take hundreds of thousands of Italians and move them there. Classic imperialism. We're going to take the lands, we're going to expel the Ethiopians to somewhere within their own lands and such as that. None of it happened. They couldn't get the Italians. They couldn't pacify the country. Nothing's left. The end. You have the Duke of Aosta sitting there in Addis Ababa trying to put together a racist apartheid regime. The only thing that survived from what Mussolini wanted was the racism, the only thing. So when you look at this, what did the Italian Empire really want, and what did it really do? I mean, we see the effects of it. I mean, the continuing wars in Ethiopia between Tigray, that's not by chance. That's a lot of what Italy wrought in Ethiopia. But Ethiopia didn't understand, Italy never understood that. You know, we treat these things as monoliths, but they're not at all. And the results are sometimes so amazingly different from what was originally stated, you don't know what to do with them afterwards. you know?
Why would you have to do with them?
The aspect...
Well, but that's precisely what imperialism is. We don't want to do with them.
We don't?
You said that you were in the State Department?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, dealing with the Balkans?
Yes, I was. I actually worked on Eastern Europe. I was just...
That's lovely. 1999, when Clinton decided to bomb Yugoslavia, Bradamas, who was the head of the New York University, he loved, for some reason, Imagining the Balkans, which had just come out, and he gave it to the Clintons to read. They don't read this thing. They read Ancient Hatreds. And of course, it's an easy to read. It's a journalist. It's a beautiful book, right? And so there is a politics. So some imperial powers are, more successful than others in doing what they want to do. The United States has managed to do quite a few things. In Libya, for example, which the Italians didn't manage to do, but Libya is kaput, right, entirely. Not to speak of Iraq and other places where we didn't need to do anything.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I don't mean to defend the U.S. position. I was only briefly at such as this. But I also saw that I would read in the paper these very strong things about what the U.S. policy was and what we were doing.
Yeah. And
there were people within that had strong views and such.
Yeah.
But the institutional vision was really lacking and really fluid. And it was part of the problem that we had such a hard time deciding what we wanted for a peace, and what we tried to offer. And anyway, the point was, I don't want to get into a political discussion on that. It was just that, what we think of as empires, we think of this giant monolithic empire. And instead, you have this huge collection of different issues that are out there.
You're absolutely right. When you look at it internally, you can see all the things. But the outside projection, I love. Is Andy here? It's not a project, but it's the projection of empire. Even if it is controversial inside, it is actually pretty strong outside, the projection.
That's true. I would agree with that.
Yeah.
So it's me. I have actually few questions and comments. First, I maybe would like to defend a little bit the new generation, because lastly I've read a text by Pierre Nora, who is a historian, and he made a text about decolonization, arguing that there's external decolonization, like when French decolonized from Algeria, but also at the same time internal decolonization, and here he enumerated class emancipation and female emancipation. So he also tended to see everything in terms of decolonization. So it's not only young generation.
Oh, no, absolutely. No, Mignolo is not young.
Yeah, I didn't want to say that. Another more question is you evoked Eva Thompson, which the author, which I kind of like her book, this Imperial Knowledges. The later works not that much, but I would like you to comment on her very elegant but maybe a little too simplistic matching of empire and nation state. Notably in this book she makes the argument that there is, in simple words, there is a good nationalism which oppose the colonization and the empire, and the bad nationalism from where the imperialism starts. So imperialism is nothing else than a bad nationalism, that the predatory one. And that's an elegant way to actually tell that there is no difference between nationalism and imperialism. And the nation state and the empire, notably every nation state who is imbued in bad nationalism becomes the empire. So it's an elegant way. And I would like you to comment on what you think about it.
I also think, that there is no difference between patriotism and nationalism, and they are different nationalisms. So I've written an article about weak nationalism, arguing that we should approach nationalism in the ways of the intensity that they display. From weak, no, from emancipatory nationalism of Mazzini. It was the most radical ideology in the early 19th century, together with republicanism, with socialism and whatnot. And then it morphed, once it became institutionalized, into different nationalism. And you have extreme nationalism, but you have also weak nationalism. So I would not say bad and good. The good nationalism for some is bad, and reverse, right? So you cannot...
Obviously. The last thing, she also kind of agrees that the Central Eastern Europe is a complicated case, and that not every struggle there can be framed in terms of colonial emancipation. Because, for example, Polish struggle against Russians was framed by Poles themselves. Poles themselves never admitted that they were colonized by Russia, because there was never Babian mimicry in there.
Yes.
They always felt supremacy over Russians, even though Russians were dominated them politically, economically, and so on and so forth. So that was definitely not a colonial struggle, but there still was a presence of coloniality there, like if we differentiate coloniality from colonialism, there was still a presence of Western coloniality, because Poland was always arguing in front of the West that Poland is more civilized and should not be dominated by barbaric Russians.
Right, yeah.
So coloniality was still there. So maybe the good approach would be to cherry pick up a little bit, or I don't know, tell that there is coloniality mixed with inter-imperiality, and that both approaches are legitimized in very specific cases.
Well, thank you. Look, as Madina also has argued, decoloniality has become such an umbrella for completely controversial things, incommensurate things, that at this point I think we should let it go. Eventually, when it is not as fashionable, it can be used again. But you yourself are using it as a synonym for emancipation. Emancipation is fine. At one point it was fashionable, now it's no longer. With Eva Thompson, I know her. We were together at Rice University, and she was telling me at one point that, the Americans liberated us in the Second World War. I said, not quite, because they bombed Sofia and they destroyed the piano of my mother, but she was not, but for her it was only, the Americans. So I'm not that sure that it was an elegant way to do it. The reason I cited it is because she introduced temporality, right? So it is not everywhere nationalism. So although Anthony Smith would argue that you have nationalism from the Jewish state or ancient Greece or Egypt, which I disagree, but she did not do that. It's one of the rare occasions where I agree with her.
I have a question too.
Yes.
Thank you for a great lecture. It summarized the whole conference in a most stringent, scholarly, and interesting way, so thanks for that. I wanted to ask a trade question from you as a historian. There was a book that came up a couple of years ago by Galdi and Armitage, The History Manifesto. It's more of a manifesto than a scholarly work, I don't know if you... And the argument there's many arguments in it, but one of them is that there's a retreat from contemporary political debate of historians and historical arguments, that the complexity and the contextualization and the details cannot be sustained within the political arenas where the debates that are about the past happen. So my question for you would be, how would historians nowadays speak truth to power, and whether that is something that historians should be doing?
Difficult to say. Power would not read us.
Yeah.
power would not listen to us. The call that we should be very popular, I think, is wrong. Nobody asks physicists to be popular. They speak a language, and it's a professional language. I think that we should stick to our profession, not being obscure and obtuse and all that, but we should stick to a rigor and a professional language. From time to time, Adam Tooze is a good example of a historian who speaks out and who does analysis. Politicians don't listen to them. We listen to them because they are on YouTube, right? So I think it's a causa perduta at this point, unless you become a secret advisor, like in the Russian Empire, to somebody very powerful.
All the spots are taken by economists, I think.
Yeah. I'm pessimistic on this front.
We have many questions now, but we'll try to fit them all in, and concision is always appreciated.
I'll try. So I very much sympathize with almost everything you said. And I agree that Timothy Snyder is completely wrong about saying that anti-colonial liberation began in the Balkans. But there is some element of what he said that I find interesting, in that he seems to be trying to find something that's situated in this historical experience that then becomes universal in a sense. And if we look elsewhere, I mean, we can see that for like Western romantics, the Balkans was an inspiration for not anti-colonial struggle, but for specific kind of national liberation struggle. So my thinking is, when we look back today, can we still, even maybe precisely because of this historical specificity, if we try to find not something that exists everywhere all over the world, but instead try to see what is specific to this historical experience that can contribute something to the world? I'm wondering if you have a thought on that.
I don't think it's, thank you, lovely question. I don't think it's nationalism. I've argued that there are certain things that the Balkans in particular can contribute partly, and namely to correct overarching paradigms. And I did that in my last book, speaking about early socialism, when I argued that it is not an oxymoron to have socialism in a peasant society. On the contrary, you can be very powerful, it can be very strong, not necessarily tying it to factory labor, but to any labor. And I gave really examples from that. And I have a few graduate students who took it up and now are doing work in Turkey on early socialism, and in Greece, and in Romania. So that is a change of paradigm. That and in fact, Jeff Ely, when he read the book, said, "Oh, I would have wanted to have the book before that. Before I wrote." Surprisingly, Marx was so popular in Bulgaria. It was the second country which had the most editions of Marx. Surprisingly, because it was an agrarian country. It's not surprising. These peasants were reading. They were. By the end of the 19th century, you have, in fact, a peasant subjectivity which is unmatched elsewhere. Only probably in France. The best book that Tony Judd wrote, his first book, the dissertation, Socialism in Provence. Nobody knows about this book, but it's his best book. So you would have that there. In Spain and Italy, it was mostly anarchism, but socialism, Marxist socialism was very interesting in this area. So there are things that you can take out, whatever field you work in. But it doesn't upset, but it brings, it is an important corrective in a general European or maybe even sometimes global perspective. So this is one example that I know. I'm sure that others might contribute also different things, especially in literature, of course. In literature, you have this thing that, peripheral literatures can be even more productive than the central literatures, but it's not. where I'm from. So, okay.
Thank you, Maria. It was a great pleasure. And I particularly really enjoyed your last sentence. So as you finished, it was very poignant. My question is about Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm wondering about operationalization of the term decoloniality in Greek and Cypriot studies, for instance, as an antinomy to post-imperial, because I felt when it first started, about maybe 20 years ago, right? The idea was that post-Ottoman approaches were naturalizing and normalizing imperial practices and almost whitewashing them, whereas using the colonial language was bringing up all the sinister aspects of Ottoman suzerainty. So I have a feeling that you said decoloniality works quite well in the Latin American context with all the historical roots, and postcoloniality in the Southeast Asian context. But when they're brought in, I feel that they're brought in very instrumentally into the Balkan context. So can you help me?
No, I mean, in the Balkan context, I will still stay with what I said. Cyprus is indeed a different problem. And the things that I've read is it is actually very felicitously used vis-a-vis British colonialism and imperialism. But nowadays you're saying vis-a-vis Ottoman. I'm not so sure that vis-a-vis Ottoman it is good, but it can be used nowadays as a settler colonialism against Northern Cyprus. And I would be curious whether it is used in this sense. So again, it depends on the locality. In the Cypriot case, I would accept it. But again, if we go with this abstract notion of decoloniality, not decolonialism, right? Decolonialism would be fine in this case, but decoloniality with all the baggage which goes as an abstract notion, embracing all this thing from the 16th century on, etc., that I think won't wash. But decolonization, yes, and settler colonialism would be, which is also a problematic notion. But in this case, it would work, especially for this Kıbrıs, the northern part.
So I'm just going to push one more thing, because we're going to have more conversation obviously outside, but so when you're an Ottomanist who have a certain idea of how the empire functioned, and you don't necessarily have to be Turkish nationalist, but nonetheless, you attribute certain beneficial or benefactory qualities to the empire, and you were mentioning one of them is the coming back notion of harmony, respect, living together. But when you are coming from outside the empire, looking at the Ottoman Empire, then you need to use a much sharper language.
Absolutely.
Unpacking, and I feel that historically that's what the revisionist historians did. They borrowed the sharpness of the colonial and post-colonial critiques, not just for the Ottomans, but also for the Russian and the Habsburg empires. Does that make sense? Instrumental
use. It does make sense. I wonder, do you have an example that they're borrowing the post? Because this is the positionality. When I was teaching in Bulgaria, I would actually tend to highlight the positive sides of the Ottoman. Because, of course, the public it's the Dark Ages, it's the terrible Turk, Once I went to the United States, you teach an empire to an empire. They love empires. So there I had to explain why these people in the end want to rise against that empire. So it depends on where you are and to whom you're talking.
I just want you to repeat that one more time, Maria, at some point, so we don't forget it. But
Maria, thank you for a wonderful presentation. And I think the more we listen to it again and read it, the deeper we'll get things. But I want to push you. You ended with poetry and prose. It seems to me there's something else going on here, which is rigor and elegance. Like, we quite like our scholarship to be both rigorous and elegant. But it's the rigor on which we have to disagree, not on the elegance. And that's the worry for me of the kind of this new taste for decoloniality and postcoloniality, that it's actually judged on its elegance more than its rigor. I'm going to smuggle in a question, because it seems to me that not only beyond disciplinary boundaries is needed, but the kind of scholarship that does travel and translation of concepts becomes incredibly important here, because these things are not fixed temporal and spatial things. Concepts travel.
Exactly, exactly. I totally agree.
Fantastic, we can move forward. That was very elegant and eloquent, Paul. Malte.
I agree with practically everything you say, so I just want to pick on a very minor detail in what you said earlier when you were trying to say that for the post-Ottoman countries, one could not call them post-colonial because in this national emancipatory movement, nobody ever said we are decolonizing, but we are emancipating ourselves from our slavery. And that is absolutely true. I looked at a text by Hristo Botev, and he likes, for example, of talking of our Constantinople tyrants, but then he talks actually a lot about colonialism. He talks about like we're heading the direction of the South American plantations, and who can prove us that we will not suffer the same fate as the population of Palestine? But what he's talking about is Western capitalism and imperialism. So my question would be, can we really make such a statement? Post-colonialism doesn't apply on the basis just of the self-narrative, because if that was the case, then late 19th century Bulgarians and Romanians were apparently colonized by Western Europe. I'd be very happy if you could disprove me, because I'm going to argue the opposite or argue the same as you later today. So I'd be happy if you could.
I mean, so do we trust the way people are expressing themselves? And I had a slight, I think I told Gruya about that. We had a very friendly exchange with Manuela Boatka. She is arguing, of course, that you have already this sensibility of proto-colonialism, and she picks up on the Dobrođanu Gerja. And she says, well, he's writing about the serfdom and all that is reminiscent of of what is happening in the plantations and all that. And I said, I still believe that it is a neologism. The feeling is there. The feeling is there, but how you call it, I think we should trust the way the people are calling it. And I told her, Dobrođanu Gerja uses the Marxist vocabulary. He says, second serfdom. That's his vocabulary. If you want to interpret his vocabulary and say that he had a false consciousness, but in fact it was neocolonialism, that's your fault. But I would stick to his vocabulary for the time. And in fact, the second serfdom has been proven to be an erroneous description, in Marxist analysis. But he used it at the time. So I would trust. I would, of course, demystify and deconstruct the way they are talking, but not ascribe to them notions that they were not familiar with. It's Max. Again, they're structural analogies, but are they called like this? Right.
don't see any other questions at the moment, which means that I will. Perhaps I should be lenient. I have to seize the prerogative of holding the microphone momentarily. Maria, thank you again for this. I absolutely second what Ivan said. This is such a wonderful synthesis of the themes of the conference. Perhaps unsurprisingly, and perhaps like some of you as well, I was recently rereading Imagining the Balkans and appreciating your very dialogic and gentle treatment of Orientalism there as both inspiration but also insufficient to historiography in the Balkans. And it strikes me that listening to you today, you're doing something quite similar in a way with decolonial thought in the present. So thinking about the zeitgeists of both the 1990s and today, is there a sort of broad analogy to be made between Orientalism as it was figuring in the discourse then and decoloniality as it is now, I guess is the question, because I felt like your sort of strategy was quite similar with regard to both, and of course I'm sympathetic to it.
I think the strategy doesn't come from the subject. It comes from what my graduate student Damir said. You are very contrarian, right? It comes from me. That's the continuity. I just like to,
Well, it's a welcome continuity across zeitgeists, I think. Are there any others who would like to chime in? Maybe we should offer you a break now and a well-deserved round of applause.